Hello, fellow bibliophiles, and welcome back to Blatantlybookish. I'm Marissa, and today I would like to do a long overdue April and May reading wrap-up. April and May were very strange months for me, as I'm sure they were for pretty much everyone. I was out of work for 2 whole months, so I had plenty of time to read, but the uncertainty and anxiety of those months made reading for me very, very difficult. I would read a book in a day and then go a week struggling to make it past a few pages. It was very frustrating to have my first real time off in years and to not be able to truly relax. However, that is not to say I didn't read, and it's not to say that I didn't read great books. I actually read some of the best books of the year in those months that feel lost to uncertainty. So without further ado, on to the books. One of the absolute highlights of April and May was The Other Bennet Sister by Janice Hadlow. This book is a must-read for any Jane Austen fan. It's a Pride and Prejudice retelling that focuses on the much overlooked Mary Bennet. Mary is kind of a smug, sanctimonious, and rather unlikable character in Pride and Prejudice. She's definitely overshadowed by her elder sisters in both charisma and importance, but this book brings her to life as the heroine of her own Austen-esque tale. The book begins with the familiar plot of Pride and Prejudice, but it follows Mary well past the end of Austen's original narrative. The strengths of this book come from Hadlow's deep understanding of Austen's own themes and her work's best qualities. Hadlow shares Austen's ability to portray nuanced emotional depth and remains true to Austen's characters while adding her own interpretations. This book is great, and I am talking about it way too much for a book that I've already made an entire video on. So if you want to hear my complete thoughts on The Other Bennet Sister, you should check that video out. I will link it down below, and I should move on to some of the other things that I read. I also read The Glass Hotel by Emily St. John Mandel, which was a highly anticipated read for me. I loved Station 11, and I couldn't wait for this to come out. And I wasn't disappointed. In fact, I was blown away. This book is about a Ponzi scheme reminiscent of Bernie Madoff's, and it follows a whole host of different characters whose lives have been irrevocably altered by fraud. Like Station 11, it's a story about the unexpected connections between people and the way that brief intersection and overlap of their lives can be so impactful. It's about the choices we make and how they can affect the directions our lives take. And it addresses all of the choices that we didn't act on, all the alternate realities that could have been but weren't, the potential selves that were never realized. It's a book about greed, ambition, regret, and guilt. But the reason this book is really so compelling is how you feel while reading it. You're trapped in this hazy, dreamlike state with fragmented bits of reality. You grasp at little bits of beautifully woven prose and characters that don't seem to fit together, but eventually they coalesce perfectly. The book seems to exist outside of time and space, which is exactly how the Glass Hotel in the book is described. The Glass Hotel is not just a metaphor. There actually is a remote hotel made of glass in this book. It serves as a catalyst for much of the characters' interactions. The appeal of this hotel, as it's described, is in its remoteness, in the ability to feel that you have escaped reality for the duration of your stay. But in a hotel like that, where you have successfully escaped your daily life, there is a sense that it must come to an end. And in reading the book, there is a pervasive feeling of the calm before a storm, of a constant and impending brink of collapse. Reading this book during the pandemic was a powerful experience for me because those sentiments of impending change and turmoil were my reality. When reading this in mid-May, I had just been rehired back at my job because of funding through small business loans, but we didn't know when we were going to reopen. So I was in this sort of holding pattern in life, not knowing when things would change, and it just felt so surreal. I was anxious about going back to work because it could happen any day, and I felt like I had to make the most of my time off. But at the same time, it was hard to start a new book or activity when any second I could be told that tomorrow was my first day back. The book's themes and tone reflected so much of my life at the time in unexpected and interesting ways, and it was just the case of a brilliant book read at the exact right moment in my life. So if you are a fan of Station 11, of literary and thought-provoking books and non-linear plots, I highly recommend this book. And honestly, even if you aren't a fan of some of those things, I would still recommend this book because I generally don't even enjoy non-linear plots. I might actually recommend reading Station 11 before The Glass Hotel. It's not a requirement by any means, but I felt like Station 11 was a bit more concrete and approachable, and my experience with reading Station 11 first really did enrich and inform my experience of reading The Glass Hotel. I also read Frog Music by Emma Donoghue. It takes place in 1876 in San Francisco, in the midst of a brutal heat wave and the height of a smallpox epidemic, racial prejudice, and riots against an influx of Chinese immigrants, and rampant baby farming. With this turbulent background, Donoghue weaves a story based on true events. The narrative focuses on Blanche, a French burlesque dancer who forms a fast friendship with the outspoken, frog-catching, cross-dressing outlaw Jenny Bonnet. Their relationship thrusts Blanche into the center of a murder mystery where she risks everything to find a killer that she believes was originally targeting herself. This book was historically fascinating. I found myself constantly stopping to research more about the historical details and context of the book. Everything about this book is tumultuous, powerful, and disturbing. It examines such strong themes of prejudice and female sexuality and motherhood. It's dark and gritty and twisted, and it was great. But had I really known what it was about, I probably would not have decided to read it in the middle of April when the pandemic was raging in New York. Instead of escaping into another world like I really needed it in mid-April, I found myself traveling back in time to an era that had far too many parallels to my own and heightened my fear and anxieties. But it was such a compelling read that I couldn't make myself stop. This was the second book I read by Emma Donoghue, and I definitely want to read more by her. The first book I read of hers, The Wonder, was also an incredibly powerful and emotional book. And it had a twisting, turning plot as well. But it was also much more subtle. Emma Donoghue picks the most interesting historical premises, and I can't wait to read more of her work and see what else she's done. I still can't bring myself to read Room, though, which is arguably her most famous book. I think it will destroy me emotionally. But I do have Slammerkin on my shelves behind me, which will in all likelihood be my next Emma Donoghue read. So, have you read much by Emma Donoghue? Are there other books that you would recommend by her? I'd be curious to know. I also read Breakfast of Champions by Kurt Vonnegut in the months of April and May. I've been meaning to read some Vonnegut after loving Slaughterhouse-Five, Cat's Cradle, and God Bless You, Mr. Rosewater. This book certainly scratched my itch for Vonnegut, but it was definitely not my favorite of his. The book itself seemed overindulgent and less of a cohesive narrative than his other books, which aren't exactly known for their cohesive narratives to begin with. Breakfast of Champions is about the recurring Vonnegut character Kilgore Trout and a car salesman named Dwayne Hoover who believes in Trout's sci-fi fictions and slowly loses his grip on reality. Kilgore Trout's character is often seen as semi-autobiographical, but this book complicates that even further by inserting Vonnegut, the actual author, into the narrative. Yes, Vonnegut is a character in his own book, and I have to say that it didn't really work for me. An aspect I love about Vonnegut's fiction is the strength of his voice, and the way that Kilgore Trout and the narrative voice already pushes the boundaries of authorial intent and interaction is enough for me. This seems like it was a literary experiment to see how far he could introduce his voice into the text and still call it fiction. I think his messages are more interesting and nuanced when he stays behind that boundary line. Still, there were moments of satire and wittiness that exemplified what I adore so much about his work. The themes of Breakfast of Champions are strikingly relevant to today's society. He examines issues of war, sex, racism, and politics in America, and reminds us of the importance of truth. I'd like to leave you with a quote from the book that shares many of the themes and looks at the relationship between fiction and reality. As I approached my 50th birthday, I had become more and more enraged and mystified by the idiot decisions made by my countrymen. And then I had come suddenly to pity them, for I understood how innocent and natural it was for them to behave so abominably, and with such abominable results. They were doing their best to live like people invented in storybooks. This was the reason Americans shot each other so often. It was a convenient literary device for ending short stories and books. Why were so many Americans treated by their government as though their lives were as disposable as paper facial tissues? Because that was the way authors customarily treated bit part players in their made-up tales. So, as always, Vonnegut is trying to make sense of the world through his fiction. And honestly, lately, the world is beginning to feel like it could be a piece of fiction. So maybe we're all just characters in some author's book. Anyway, if you've never read Vonnegut, start with Slaughterhouse-Five or Cat's Cradle. Please don't start with this book. If this was the first Vonnegut book I ever read, I would probably write him off as too postmodern for me and never pick one of his books up again. And that would be a shame. In May, I also read The Odd Woman by George Gissing, which I hosted as a read-along with Katie from Books and Things. I had a great time with this read-along, so thank you to Katie and thank you to everyone who read along with us. But just in case you didn't participate or see any of the Odd Read-Along videos, The Odd Woman is a surprisingly proto-feminist work of Victorian fiction that deals with gender roles and women's rights and changing positions in England in interesting ways. It looks at the odd women in society. Not odd like strange, but odd meaning uncoupled, unpaired, or in other words, unmarried. The roles for unmarried women in the Victorian period were traditionally rather limited. It was expected of women to marry and have children in order to have a meaningful and fulfilling life. But in the late Victorian period, when The Odd Woman was published, there began to be an increase in opportunities for unmarried women. The Odd Woman looks at various single women and how they cope with spinsterhood and find meaningful places for themselves in a society that doesn't typically value their lifestyles. And in looking at single women, it also becomes a fascinating exploration and critique of marriage as an institution. I could probably go on about The Odd Woman for a while, but if you want to hear more about it, you should check out the spoiler-free discussion that Katie and I had, which is posted on my channel. And if you have read it, you should also look for the more spoilery half of that discussion, which we posted on Katie's channel. In April, I also read The Five by Hallie Rubenhold on audiobook. This has been going around quite a bit on BookTube lately, but I found it particularly interesting to read right before The Odd Woman, as both books deal with gender in the Victorian period. The Five delves into the lives of Jack the Ripper's 5 most famous victims: Marianne Nichols, Annie Chapman, Elizabeth Stride, Catherine Eddowes, and Mary Jane Kelly. Most books that include these names focus on their horrible deaths or their murderer, Jack the Ripper, but Rubenhold's aim in this book is to reclaim the stories of these women's lives. Most people know that Jack the Ripper killed prostitutes, and they know little else of his victims. But Rubenhold challenges even this basic knowledge, showing the reader that there is no hard proof that 4 of the victims even worked in the sex trade. Instead, these women were struggling with mental illness, addiction, and poverty. Like the odd women in Gissing's book, these women were on the outskirts of society. They were addicts, widows, homeless, separated from their husbands, and so they were viewed as having loose morals. Why else would they be on the streets as prey for Jack the Ripper, unless they were immoral prostitutes? And so they were branded as such. While there's a great deal of speculation in this book as to certain aspects of the lives of these 5 women, there's also a ton of compelling details about Victorian London. This book touches on syphilis, workhouses, infant mortality, the female alcoholic. I've read a considerable amount of nonfiction about the Victorian era at this point, but this book discusses themes that aren't usually addressed, or if mentioned, take up a chapter or 2 at most, not the entirety of the book. What struck me most about this book was how it portrayed the intense ease of fluctuation in socioeconomic status at the time. Many of these women were born to respectable households, but some tragedy or major event in their lives led them to destitution. For me, this also related to my reading of The Odd Woman. In Gissing's book, so much happens so rapidly. Within the first few pages, 2 sisters of genteel birth lose their father and find themselves suddenly struggling to secure financial futures and maintain their class status. Though they are fictional and not brutally murdered by Jack the Ripper, Gissing's characters actually share a lot in common with the lives of these 5 women that Rubenhold uncovers. The Five was a fantastic and compelling read, and if you're interested in the Victorian era, specifically gender roles in the late Victorian era, I highly recommend reading these 2 books, and actually reading these 2 books in conjunction with each other. I also read A Place for Us by Fatima, Farheen, Mirza as a buddy read with Mary from Happily Ever Esh. It was delightful having someone to discuss this book with, and Mary is just so lovely and thoughtful. She was a joy to read with, and she also makes amazing content on BookTube, so I'll link her channel below in case you are not familiar with her. A Place for Us is a slow-burning family saga about a Muslim couple from India raising their 3 children in America. The book begins during the eldest daughter's wedding as she realizes that her estranged brother is present. We dip back and forth through time and perspective as the story of this family and the reasons for the estrangement of the brother and son slowly come into focus. The book is full of so much detail and little stories that inform our opinions of each of the characters. It deals with themes of responsibility and parenthood and the pressure of parental expectations in immigrant families, the role of religion in a family and close-knit community, and profound regret. Though I generally enjoyed the book, I didn't have as profound an attachment to it as other booktubers and reviewers seem to. I enjoyed the slow build of the story and the experience of reading it with Mary. I enjoyed discussing these important and compelling themes, and while I did have an intense emotional reaction at times while reading this, I felt that my overall response to the book was diminished by some of the structural issues I had. There was an entire character in the family who we never get to hear from, and a character who only shares their perspective at the tail end of the book. These were clearly choices the author intentionally made, but they simply didn't work for me. Losing the perspective of one of the siblings seemed like a missed opportunity. It would have brought a new insight into the family dynamic, but instead this character became a shadow of another sibling. They served to fill a place in the birth order instead of realizing their full potential. And at the end of the book, the perspective we finally received and were desperately waiting for felt discontinuous with the portrayal of the same character we had witnessed through the entirety of the book. Mary and I discussed this amongst other things, and she suggested that the perceived change in voice was due to the maturation of the character. While this is a lovely explanation to come to terms with the discontinuity I felt, the beauty of this book for me was the slow emergence of characters and the ability to watch their progressions and maturation over time. To have a new perspective at the end that felt so incongruous with what I had been reading ever so slightly diminished the power of that slow build for me. This is still an amazing book that I would encourage you to read. The exploration of themes is brilliant, as are the more fully formed characters. The eldest daughter and the mother are my 2 favorite perspectives in the book, and the mystery behind the son's estrangement and how we are slowly fed puzzle pieces that explain this lead up to his situation is beautifully done. I just personally see a few ways that this book, though already amazing, could have been even more powerful for me. I also read the second book in the Nevermoor series back in April, called Wundersmith, The Calling of Morrigan Crow. It's a middle grade series that has been compared to Harry Potter in tone and theme, but it centers around a girl named Morrigan Crow. It was a really fun read, just like the first book in the series. It's fun to escape into another world and slowly learn about the different rules that govern those characters. I personally think that there is a major missed opportunity with this series, though, when it comes to the treatment of good and evil. The villain is classically corrupted by magic, by power, and is therefore evil, while the protagonist shares something in common with the villain, yet struggles against corruption. There's nothing wrong with that narrative. It's spurred many amazing franchises like Harry Potter and Star Wars, to name a few. However, the first book in the series sets up a really interesting opportunity for the villain to be more nuanced and utilitarian in their ideas, rather than simply power-hungry, corrupt, and flat-out evil. The dynamic of Morrigan Crow and the villain just seemed all too familiar to Harry Potter and Voldemort, and making this villain less one-dimensional would have set the series apart. In the second book, the opportunity to make the villain a more nuanced character seemed to close itself off. It seems that the villain is more one-dimensional than I originally gave them credit for. I'm still going to read the third book in the series, which comes out in August, I believe. This book is so fun. The series is compelling and quirky, but I would really like to see the series come into its own more and do something a little different to distinguish itself. Something that doesn't feel all too familiar to me in many ways. I haven't counted the series out yet. I think it's supposed to be 9 books long, so a lot could change and develop further as the series progresses. And like I said, it is so fun to read, and you get this sense of childhood whimsy that you get with Harry Potter, and I'm enjoying that. The last books I read during these months were 2 books from the Discworld series, Guards, and Eric by Terry Pratchett. The Discworld was a wonderful place to escape to while in lockdown. It's really always a wonderful place to escape to. Guards is about the city watch of Ankh-Morpork, which is basically like the police force, and how they come into being. There's a secret society that summons a dragon which terrorizes the city, and it's up to the city watch to take action. I know this doesn't sound like my typical read. The Discworld books are fantastical in plot, but through their dry wit and humor, they always tackle important themes. This one covers the role of government and the police force, idealism, how one claims and holds on to power. It examines concepts of masculinity through being a warped sort of retelling of the quintessential dragon slayer tale, where the heroic and chivalrous knight slays a dragon to protect a fair lady and win her love and companionship. That isn't how the book goes at all, but it definitely evokes that familiar storyline and purposely diverges from it. Many people say that Guards is one of the best books in the series, and that it's a great place to start with the series. And I agree that it has been one of my favorite books so far, and I see why starting here would not be such a bad idea. As the first book in the City Watch sub-series of Discworld, it introduces a whole cast of new characters that are evidently featured in the rest of the City Watch books. And of course, the humor and wit in this book is some of Terry Pratchett's finest. So I'd say if you've been listening to me talk about Discworld and don't really get the appeal, this wouldn't be a bad book to pick up. I feel like if you like Discworld, you would also like satire in general, or Vonnegut's works, or Tom Robbins. Wow, I haven't read a Tom Robbins book in a really long time. Anyway, I suppose I should also briefly talk about Eric, which is the other Discworld book I read. I don't want to discuss it too much. It's Terry Pratchett's retelling of Faust, and I didn't like it quite as much as Guards. I think that in general, I just don't like the Rincewind series of Discworld as much as the other sub-series. I'm not really sure why. Rincewind is just such a silly character in so many ways, and his adventures may be a bit too bizarre for me. I'm still going to continue reading them when they come up in the book order. I just look forward to getting further into some of the other sub-series a lot more. So that is what I have for you today. It was a lot though. Have you read any of these books? I'd love to know what you thought of them in detail. If you're a fan of Discworld, I would love to know if you go in order or skip around, or if you have a favorite book or favorite sub-series within Discworld. Have you read more Emily St. John Mandel than I have? If so, what do you think about her earlier works? Because honestly, I'm very curious about them. I'd love to hear about your experiences with Emma Donoghue and gender in the Victorian period. Really, there's just a ton to talk about from this wrap-up, so I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Thanks for making it to the end of this long video, and I look forward to seeing you in another video soon. Bye!